Hi everyone, my name is Pam Lanuri. I'm Head of Expedition Operations at Noble Caledonia, and today on our Naturalist Chat we have Craig Ward all the way over in Cairns, Australia. How are you, Craig?
Very well, thanks, Pam. How are you?
Good, very nice to see you again. Now, for those of you who haven't come across Craig over the many itineraries that he covers, he really specializes in the Kimberley. In fact, he's written a couple of books on the region, and he's one of the top naturalists of the region. So we're quite lucky to have him as our premier expedition leader for the whole Indo-Pacific region, but especially for Kimberley. It's a tough region. It's very special, and I think it's not that well known. Would you agree?
Absolutely. It's quite genuinely one of the most remote places on Earth, and I've often mused with many of my friends over here in Australia. If you spoke to your average Australian and asked them where the Kimberley is, they'd probably suggest it was in Africa. So it's a very little known place, a big place, incredibly remote, but very little known for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we have a mining town called Kimberley, and it's not like, it's very industrialized. So the first time I heard of Kimberley were when people were saying, oh, you've got to cruise the Kimberley, cruise the Kimberley. And I thought, oh, okay, well, what's this about? So it really is, I think, internationally speaking, slightly a secret gem. And it's an absolute marvel once you get there. No one would know better than you. But tell us, what would pull someone to come from within Australia or anywhere across the world all the way over, because it is a trek to get there. Even if you're coming from Melbourne, it's a trek to get there. What would pull you over all the way? What's the main thing do you think would pull you over to the Kimberley?
Where to begin? As you mentioned, I've been visiting the Kimberley now for 16 consecutive years in a row, running expeditions, carrying out research. I wrote a book on the place, and there are many really great volumes of work on this very special place. Where to begin? So it's the one of the true wilderness areas in the world. It's one area in the world where only 4% of global oceans are pristine. So the rest of the oceans of the world that are in that 4% that are pristine are the high Arctic and Antarctica, and yet the Kimberley finds its way into that bracket. It has the largest migration of humpback whales, the largest population of migrating humpback whales annually. The coastline is the longest undefiled coastline in the world. It's full of unique plants and animals. That's what I wrote about, the endemism of the place. And it houses some of the most fantastic natural phenomena that you'll ever see. We mustn't forget that it has amongst the largest tide ranges in the world, well over 10 meters. And so when you have this incredibly rugged coastline that's been affected by these enormous tides, it's just breathtaking. Let me try, I'm not very good with this sort of stuff, Pam, but let me try and bring up this power.
While you jump over to the slides there, I just wanted to say the perfect nutshelling that was of what the Kimberley, of the highlights of the Kimberley, but also that whole idea of being pristine ocean is something that, I don't know, it may be hard to visualize, what that really means. But I know the first time I cruised the Kimberley, after a couple of days, I was like, there's no garbage here. There's just no garbage here on the beach. And I think it's that Indonesian thoroughfare current that just seems to shield it from any floating garbage that other pristine wilderness areas have been inflicted by. And there's just nothing there. It's really, after a while, you actually notice something's missing, and it's quite amazing to realize there's garbage missing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you might not see another soul for the 10 days that you're on the coast. You may pass a ship or two, perhaps in the night, but you can actually, apart from when we deliberately connect with the few folk that are on the coast, you can quite often barely see a soul. So let me just, whilst we're talking about why it's so unique, I'll just acknowledge this slide. So this is the view looking back down the King George River. I'll put it into context with some satellite images in a moment, but we take a hike from the water level down there that you can see up to this viewpoint. And I make a point when we're up there to mention that fewer people stand at that lookout point than make it to Everest Base Camp on an annual basis. Absolute fact. So statistically, no one on Earth has actually ever been there. Now, let me call this up to go back to why this is so unique. So this is the map of the coast that I'd produced for my little book. Now, if I go to this slide, hopefully you can see a pair of red dots. Are they pretty clear?
Yeah, very clear, thanks.
Okay, great. So it doesn't really matter where those red dots are, but you know, for the sake of completion, the northern one is the mouth of the King Edward River. The southern one is a place that we call Yampi Sound, where there's a whole load of things going on, and we spend a couple of days in that region. The straight line distance between those two red dots is 400 kilometers. So far, so good. You with me?
Yeah.
If you were to traverse the coastline, and I'm pointing my finger here, I don't know if you can see it, but if you were to traverse the coastline between those two red dots, you would travel a distance of 12,800 kilometers.
Sure, so there's a lot of little bays and inlets and islands going on there, hey?
It just offers you a lifetime of exploration, this place. And again, you know, you can see features such as the Prince Regent River about halfway between the dots, this impossibly straight scar of a river with these huge tides. When the tide's out, forget about it. You can't even get your ship down there, let alone go up the river. So the huge tides that move through here just add an additional dimension to what is already an incredible place.
And actually, you know, I know the mangroves, you'll know the statistic on it, but it's one of the largest and untouched, as you say, undefiled mangrove forests in the world, which is such an important gift to the planet in a way. And it's so important that these areas remain protected, preserved, appreciated as they are in their natural state.
Oh, absolutely. And we're just really getting a handle on how substantial and how significant the various habitats that the Kimberley supports are. So you're quite right, St. George Basin has the highest density of mangroves by area of anywhere in the world. It's not especially biodiverse for mangroves. I think it's about 17 species. You compare that to other areas in the top end, it's more like 50. So it's not particularly biodiverse for mangroves, but the expanse of the mangrove habitat there, and of course you know very well how essential they are as nurseries for loads of different species, including those that find their way out to the reef. So the seagrass habitat there is much more expensive than we realized, and the reefs are just quite stunning, which is incredible to think that they have to contend with 10-meter tides. It's a very, very special place for sure.
Yeah, it really is. So I was just thinking the King George River there, although you showed the picture of the hike, it is quite an intrepid hike. So only, I don't know, maybe 10% of the people we take will actually do that particular hike, but the actual cruising, the Zodiac cruising down the river itself is phenomenal. And the word that really comes to mind when you think of what you do in the Kimberley and what to see and all that is grandeur, the sense of grandeur, owing largely to the geology and the big landscapes. It really is stunning, and photographically, that's a highlight.
Absolutely, and so let me try that again, and I'll try and illustrate what you were just describing. So I've deliberately not included too many photographs of this place because I just really don't want to spoil it. You know, like you say, the grandeur unfolds before your very eyes. So if I use it, this is taken from Google Earth, so I'll acknowledge Google Earth at this point. So this is the start of the King George River. So you come into the mouth of the river having crossed Kalama Bay, which in itself is a fascinating place. You can see that there are these wonderful scars in this incredibly ancient landscape, the sandstone features here. And so we enter the mouth of the river in the Zodiac. Like you say, unfortunately, not everybody can make that hike, but everybody uses the Zodiacs to come into the river. And if I just advance this then, so this is moving up the river a little bit further. At this point, there's another wonderful bend that takes you around to an incredible waterfall. We usually don't have time to access that because we want to press on further up the river. We travel in one direction 16 kilometers from the ship. So it's a heck of a Zodiac cruise.
Yeah.
And by the time you get down into this section here, you have steep sides in the gorge here, reaching up to 120 meters. And so it just becomes more and more spectacular as you advance further and further towards the largest twin falls in Western Australia. And so this is where we find ourselves standing to look back down the river, but all of the Zodiacs come up into here and visit the two falls before eventually making the trip back. And so we have options ranging from 5.5 hours if you're doing the hike to, you know, just a couple of hours for those who just want to zip up there on a short trip and get those great holiday photos of the falls before returning. But most would probably spend 3.5 hours up there, and more often than not come back wishing they'd had more time. You know, it's a very, very special place.
And Craig, in the same way that the tides offer such a diversity during one day, you know, up and down all in one day, huge difference in tides, making a huge difference in the landscape. Also, the rain season versus the dry season through the year makes an incredible difference to the experience of not only the falls, but the whole area. I mean, you can't really go there too heavily in the wet season, or I've never been. How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And I've written about this. It's a land of two halves in a lot of ways. So if you visit early in the season, again, you have to wait for the rains to subside. You just can't get in there. Of course, it's also, there's a real cyclone danger when the wet season is unfolding through to about April, something like that. If you get in there early, there's fresh water everywhere, but it quickly dries up. It's just the nature of the landscape. Yeah. But then later in the year, the waterfalls are dry, but then the wildlife really starts to present itself. For example, the migrating humpback whales. Yeah. And there are days when we're traveling from A to B and we have to just stop the ship because we can't legally continue to advance. We're just too close to the whales, you know.
Yeah, so I must say that Kimberley really jumps out as a humpback whale watching highlight area of the world for me. And not just humpback whales, there are loads of other cetacean species that we've come across there, these sort of once in a lifetime types of species. Remember, I think that one year we saw Pseudorca, you were, I'm sure, in there that season. And we, as a fleet, decided to do a voluntary slower speed between Broome and all the way over to Yampi Sound, just to avoid any potential for nighttime traveling and any negative effects on the whales. It's something where you're working in high concentration of the whales, you really need to think about it. And we're lucky we're in a fleet that really takes it into consideration. But the cetaceans all around, those snubfin dolphins, so many unique tick boxes if you're up for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Snubfin dolphin you mentioned, one of the few endemic dolphin species in the world, maybe a handful, so they're only found on the Australian northern coast. We see them quite frequently. You're right, Pseudorca, we've seen short-fin pilot whales. Several other species of dolphins are quite commonly encountered in places like the Hunter River, for example. And that's just to name a couple of the cetaceans. Of course, dugongs are quite commonly sighted. Wildlife, so never a guarantee. And it's a very rare trip where guests don't get to see one, if not many, crocodiles. There's plenty of big crocs in the Kimberley waters. So that would be perhaps one minor disappointment. Reluctant to use that phrase. The water's so inviting, but we do have a blanket policy. We do not swim in the ocean. Every other operator that has spent time in the Kimberley has had some saltwater crocodile related incident. We're the only ones who have not, and that's because we pay respect to these wonderful animals. It's their backyard, and we're just going there to find them and have a look at them, but we're certainly not going in with them, that's for sure.
No, I mean, as you say, when you mentioned Hunter River, I was just thinking towards the crocs. It's such a highlight to see them, these great and some really small as well, crocs in their natural environment. Saltwater crocodile is such an impressive predator. But it is kind of hilarious because you'll come to these beaches with this like white sand and crystal clear water, and it's hot. I mean, it's hot and dry in the Kimberley, and all you want to do, like a moth to the flame, is go in that water, and we absolutely do not and cannot. And so you got to sort of take that into consideration where you think you're going to a really hot tropical area. It's like, this is not a swimming spot. There's sharks and crocs and everything else under the sun. So we stay on those boats for sure. But there's pretty good gear these days, covering up with your big sort of brim sun hats and your long sleeves and stuff like that. So it can maintain in the heat.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we're very, very sun smart when we take our expeditions into the Kimberley. We spend an awful lot of time reminding guests to be exactly that. Plenty of sunscreen, hats, loads and loads of water. The Zodiac team are very, very aware that it's important to keep the Zodiacs moving so that there's airflow and it's much cooler that way. And whenever we stop to have a chat about something, we do our level best to find some shade. Of course, if it's a whale or a croc and it's just happens to be in an inconvenient place, then we'll stop until it's uncomfortable or well before that. And then we just get moving and find some more shade, you know. But
Yeah.
we do manage the time of the day very readily. So we'll often try and start quite early and then have a nice block of time off through the heat of the day, the middle of the day, a nice leisurely lunch, of course, and then operate later on into the afternoon when it's starting to cool again. The tides can play havoc with that planning. If the tide says, this is when you have to come and see me, then so be it. But we are very, very aware of the fact that it's a tropical part of the world, and that's what makes it so special. Yeah.
That's true. Now, Craig, the last thing I thought would be really worth talking about in terms of Kimberley is the local communities and the rock art. For some people,
Yes.
this is some of the best in the world. It's a real highlight, and the rock art is certainly something that sticks with me in my mind long after the Kimberley.
Well, shall we quickly go back to those images and let's address that as we do a real rapid fire run through some of the other images. Otherwise, we'll be here until, I don't know what time it is in your part of the world right now, but it's well into the evening for me. But as you can tell, I find it rather easy to talk about the Kimberley. So this is, again, not a particularly inspiring image, but this is a place that we go, Vansittart Bay, and we land here on a wonderful sandy beach, and we walk across this salt pan here. This floods with the tide, but walking across there into the eucalypt forest at the back, there is a World War II plane wreck, and it is really quite fascinating, quite unlike anything else that we do on any other day of the trip. But what we also do here in Vansittart Bay, you're talking about the rock art. I've deliberately chosen an image that is faded and degraded. There's loads and loads of this to see. And there is an ever-growing body of support to suggest that this is the oldest art in the world. And the estimates for the age of this are starting to be pushed out to something like 45,000 years. Now, this particular example might not be anything like that old, but there's clear evidence to suggest continued occupation, human occupation of this part of the world for at least that amount of time. And again, some of the more striking figures are pushing it out beyond to sort of 65,000 years. So we get to see this up close and personal. Some of it's fairly tricky to get to, but we've deliberately selected some sites where everybody can make it. So you would expect that everybody on the trip would be able to see this, possibly the oldest rock art in the world.
Yeah. And Craig, can I just add that I'm very proud that I know you in particular, as well as us at Noble, all of us at Noble have been very proactive in making sure those sites remain protected, because there's not always custodians. In fact, there's usually not custodians on site, although there are custodians of the art, generally speaking. And it's, it would be so easy for people to just go there and touch the walls. And you have been instrumental in making sure we have really good guidelines on how we behave around the art and make sure we always leave it there absolutely unharmed.
Well, again, thanks for pointing it out. It's absolutely true. Most of the places that we visit, we don't connect with the traditional owners. We've connected with them outside of the location, but in practice, they just are unable to spend much, if any, time at all on their homeland. So they've given us permission to visit, which we're incredibly grateful for. But one of the reasons that we are so readily accepted is because we went out of our way to ask them if they would mind if we put our own measures in place to ensure that the art was protected from, the inadvertent hand or the shoulder brushing up against it. And so we've established our own standards of how to protect the art, including putting little barriers and signs and that sort of thing. You can still see the art without it being bothered by this signage, so that your photographs are okay, but we're just ensuring that we are respecting and doing our bit to preserve it. And when we get further down the coast, where we do meet with the locals, they get to come out and stay on camp there. We're the only group who are allowed to visit that location on the rare occasion that the traditional owners are not there. That's how much they respect our respect for their country. So it's a real privilege, actually. Yeah.
And a lot of that is actually thanks to you, Craig. So thanks so much for being our custodian of the Kimberley. It's something that, it's a privilege to go to these sorts of areas. It's so little known for most people around the world. And when you go there, you walk away with a greater appreciation, not only for these wonderful cultures, but also for all the earth in its pristine environment, shall I say, an ambassador for the wilderness altogether.
Yeah, some places are just exactly as nature intended them to be. And the Kimberley is definitely one of those places, for sure.
That's so nicely said. Craig, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to the next chat, and enjoy your evening.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Have a great day.
Bye.